January the 12th, 1945 marked the day the eastern sky turned red, with something far more terrible than dawn. Soviet artillery commander Marshal Georgy Zhukov stood before the largest concentration of firepower ever assembled on a single front, knowing that in mere hours the gates of hell would swing open upon Nazi Germany. The numbers were staggering: over 2 million Red Army soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 41,000 artillery pieces stretched across the Vistula-Oder front from the Baltic to the Carpathians. According to historical military records from the Soviet archives declassified in the 1990s, this represented the single largest military operation in human history up to that point, dwarfing even the Normandy landings in scale and ferocity. The German defenders knew what was coming but could scarcely believe the magnitude. Generaloberst Josef Harpe, commander of Army Group A, paced the frozen ground of his headquarters near Kielce, Poland, reviewing reports that seemed like fever dreams. His intelligence officers spoke of entire forests transformed into staging areas, of tank formations so vast they could be heard rumbling from kilometers away, of supply depots that stretched to the horizon. Harpe commanded fewer than 400,000 men, exhausted veterans mixed with boys barely old enough to shave and old men who remembered the previous war. His tank strength had dwindled to pathetic levels, perhaps 1,200 panzers scattered across hundreds of kilometers, many immobilized by lack of fuel or spare parts. The German High Command had gambled everything on the Ardennes offensive in the west, bleeding the Eastern Front white to create that final, desperate thrust toward Antwerp. Now the bill had come due with interest calculated in blood and fire. The elaborate defensive positions that might have held the Soviets, the networks of bunkers, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles, existed mostly on paper and in the optimistic reports sent to Berlin. In reality, hastily dug trenches filled with ice and mud, manned by hollow-eyed soldiers who had long ago stopped believing in victory and now fought only for survival or from sheer momentum of duty. Young Gefreiter Klaus Zimmermann crouched in one such trench near the Magnesow bridgehead on the Vistula, his hands trembling not from cold alone. The 19-year-old former student from Dresden had been at the front for exactly 11 days. Around him, veterans with frostbitten faces and dead eyes checked their weapons with mechanical precision, conserving every bullet, every Panzerfaust rocket, knowing that resupply was a fantasy. The bombardment would begin before dawn. Everyone knew it, felt it in their bones like animals sensing an earthquake. Across the frozen Vistula, Soviet Lieutenant Alexander Sokolov checked his T-34 tank for the third time that night, running his gloved hand along the cold steel as if it were a living creature. The 23-year-old from Stalingrad had driven tanks since the dark days of 1942, had seen his country invaded, his city destroyed, his family scattered. Now he was returning the favor with interest. His tank bore chalked inscriptions: for Moscow, for Leningrad, for Stalingrad. Each word was a debt being collected, each kilometer westward a payment extracted in German blood and ash. The night before the storm held a quality of unreality, suspended time before catastrophe. January the 12th at precisely 4:45 in the morning, the world ended in thunder. The Soviet barrage began with such intensity that German soldiers 3 kilometers behind the lines were thrown from their bunks, the earth itself seeming to convulse in agony. Marshal Zhukov had concentrated his artillery with scientific precision, over 200 guns per kilometer of front in key breakthrough sectors. The sound was beyond comprehension, beyond description, a physical force that ruptured eardrums, stopped hearts, drove men mad within minutes. Historical accounts from the Bundesarchiv military archives note that some German positions simply ceased to exist, their defenders entombed in collapsed bunkers or atomized by direct hits, their bodies never recovered or identified. Klaus Zimmermann discovered that terror had depths previously unimagined. The trench walls collapsed inward as shells walked up and down the line with methodical precision. The veteran beside him, a Feldwebel named Ernst, who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, simply vanished in a flash of fire and displaced earth. Klaus found himself screaming, but could not hear his own voice over the apocalyptic roar. The bombardment continued for 2 hours, 120 minutes that stretched into eternity. each second containing a lifetime of fear. When it finally lifted, Klaus emerged from his collapsed dugout to find the landscape transformed into something from another planet, cratered and smoking, corpses scattered like broken dolls. Then came the tanks. Alexander Sokolov's T-34 lurched forward with thousands of its brothers, a steel tide rolling westward under cover of morning fog. The Soviet doctrine was brutally simple: overwhelm, penetrate, exploit, destroy. Tanks moved in echelons, supporting infantry huddled on their decks, crushing obstacles, grinding through resistance. German anti-tank guns opened fire from camouflaged positions, and some Soviet tanks erupted in flames, but the momentum could not be stopped. For every tank destroyed, 3 more surged forward. The numerical advantage was simply crushing. In some sectors, Soviet forces outnumbered defenders 10 to 1. General Oberst Harp stood in his command post receiving reports that read like casualizations of death. The 12th Army's front had been penetrated in multiple places. The 4th Panzer Army was falling back in disorder. Communications with forward units had ceased. Whether because they were overrun or simply ceased to exist remained unclear. Harp knew military history well enough to recognize what was happening. This was not a battle. It was an execution. The question was no longer whether the front would break, but how fast the collapse would occur. The breakthrough came faster than even Zhukov had anticipated. By afternoon of the first day, Soviet spearheads had penetrated 30 kilometers in some sectors, racing past German strongpoints that found themselves isolated, surrounded, bypassed. The German defensive doctrine relied on mobile reserves counterattacking to seal breaches, but the reserves were phantoms, divisions that existed on organizational charts but had been bled white in previous battles. When orders came to counterattack, commanders found themselves leading Kampfgruppen of perhaps company strength, expected to stop entire Soviet armies. Klaus survived the first day through a combination of luck, cowardice, and the simple chaos of retreat. His unit ceased to exist as a coherent formation by noon. He stumbled westward with other survivors, discarding equipment to move faster, seeing burned-out vehicles and frozen corpses lining every road. The retreat was already becoming a rout, military discipline dissolving as survival instinct took over. SS blocking detachments had been positioned behind the lines to prevent desertion, but even they were swept up in the torrent of retreat, shooting a few unfortunates as examples before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. January the 14th saw Soviet forces advancing so rapidly that their own supply lines struggled to keep pace. Tank commanders like Alexander Sokolov found themselves racing across Polish countryside at speeds unprecedented in military history, 40, 50, sometimes 60 kilometers in a single day. The speed was intoxicating and terrifying. German resistance had not collapsed entirely, but had fragmented into isolated pockets of fanatical defense surrounded by vast stretches of abandoned territory. According to declassified Soviet General Staff documents examined by military historians in the 2000s, Stalin himself was telephoning front commanders daily, demanding they push harder, faster, give the Germans no time to establish new defensive lines. The ancient fortress city of Krakow fell on January the 19th with barely a fight. Wehrmacht commanders, recognizing the city's cultural significance and military indefensibility, withdrew rather than see it destroyed. Soviet troops marched through streets lined with medieval architecture, past Wawel Castle and the old Jewish quarter, where the ghosts of murdered thousands seemed to watch silently. For Polish civilians who had endured 5 years of Nazi occupation, the arrival of Soviet forces brought conflicting emotions: liberation from one tyranny, arrival of another. The soldiers themselves were surprised by the relatively intact city. Most had grown accustomed to fighting through rubble and ruins. Further north, the situation devolved into pure nightmare. The fortress city of Poznan refused to surrender, its garrison commander declaring he would hold until relieved or death. The Soviets bypassed it, leaving blocking forces to contain the garrison, while main forces continued westward. This created a peculiar situation: islands of German resistance surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory, cut off but fighting on, tying down troops, but fundamentally irrelevant to the strategic situation. The garrison would hold until February the 23rd, long after the war had moved hundreds of kilometers west. Klaus Zimmermann's journey westward became a descent into a particular circle of hell reserved for retreating armies. Food was whatever could be scavenged from abandoned supply depots or taken from Polish civilians at gunpoint. Sleep was stolen in frozen ditches or burned-out buildings, always with one eye open for Soviet patrols. The roadsides were lined with abandoned equipment, trucks out of fuel, tanks with broken tracks, artillery pieces spiked and left behind. Worse were the bodies, German and civilian alike, victims of Soviet strafing runs or simple exhaustion and exposure. The winter of 44-45 was particularly brutal, temperatures dropping to -20 Celsius, and men simply froze where they fell. The Oder River represented Germany's last natural barrier before Berlin. Throughout late January, Wehrmacht engineers worked frantically to prepare defensive positions along its western bank, blowing bridges, laying minefields, positioning the few remaining tanks and assault guns to cover likely crossing points. General Oberst Harp, who had managed to maintain some coherence in his shattered forces through sheer force of will, established a new defensive line and demanded reinforcements from Berlin. What arrived were Volkssturm units, the people's militia composed of boys and old men with minimal training and obsolete weapons, expected to stop the Red Army's finest. By January the 31st, Soviet advance guards reached the Oder near Kustrin, barely 80 kilometers from Berlin. They had advanced nearly 600 kilometers in 19 days, an operational tempo that shattered all previous records. Alexander Sokolov's tank had survived through luck and his crew's skill, though his original vehicle had been knocked out near Lodz, and he now commanded a replacement. Standing on the Oder's eastern bank, looking across at German territory proper, he felt strange satisfaction mixed with anticipation. The beast's lair was in sight. February the 1st brought unexpected respite as the Soviet advance ground to a halt along the Oder River line. The reasons were multiple and complex. Supply lines stretched to breaking point, troops exhausted by weeks of continuous combat and advance, and surprisingly stiff German resistance at key crossing points. Marshal Zhukov faced a decision that would haunt military historians for decades: push immediately toward Berlin, or pause to consolidate. Stalin, calling from Moscow, demanded immediate advance, but for once Zhukov resisted. His forces needed time, and hasty river crossings against prepared defenses could be catastrophic. According to memoirs published by Soviet commanders in later decades, Zhukov estimated he needed at least 2 weeks to prepare properly for the final push. The German defenders used this time desperately. Every day without Soviet attack was a gift used to strengthen positions, bring up what meager reinforcements existed, and prepare for the apocalypse everyone knew was coming. General Theodor Buss's Ninth Army took responsibility for the Oder front directly facing Berlin, deploying his forces in a network of strongpoints designed to channel Soviet attacks into killing zones. The strategy was fundamentally defensive: trade space for time, make the Soviets pay for every meter, hope that somehow the Western Allies might intervene, or that miracle weapons promised by propaganda might materialize. Klaus Zimmermann found himself assigned to a hastily formed infantry battalion, defending a small village on the Oder's western bank. The Volkssturm men around him ranged from 16 to 60 years old, farmers and shopkeepers in ill-fitting uniforms clutching rifles that predated the First World War. Their training had consisted of 3 days of marching and shooting. Yet these civilians in uniform displayed surprising determination, motivated by reports, some true, many exaggerated, of Soviet atrocities against German civilians. The propaganda machine had worked overtime to ensure every defender knew what defeat meant: revenge for 6 million Jews, 20 million Soviet citizens, countless others murdered by Nazi Germany's systematic evil. The Soviet bridgeheads established along the Oder became fortresses in reverse, positions on the western bank held against constant German counterattacks. The fighting for these bridgeheads possessed a particular viciousness: small unit actions in frozen forests and bombed villages where quarter was neither asked nor given. Alexander Sokolov's tank unit found itself supporting infantry assaults against German bunkers, methodically reducing strong points with combinations of direct fire and infantry assault. The Red Army had learned brutal lessons about combined arms warfare at immense cost, and now applied those lessons with terrible efficiency. The civilian population caught between the armies faced impossible choices. Those in the path of Soviet advance fled westward in massive columns, creating refugee streams that clogged roads and complicated military movements. Stories of Soviet revenge, rape, murder, looting spread like wildfire, some true, many exaggerated, but all contributing to panic. The Nazi regime had sown wind, and now Germany reaped whirlwind. Millions of civilians abandoned homes that families had occupied for generations, carrying what they could in carts or on their backs, fleeing ahead of an army they had been taught to view as subhuman monsters. February proved a month of grinding attritional warfare. Soviet forces expanded their bridgeheads incrementally, paying for each gain in blood. German forces launched counterattacks with whatever forces could be scraped together. Kampfgruppen formed around a few tanks or assault guns, supported by infantry armed with Panzerfausts. These attacks occasionally reclaimed ground but could not fundamentally alter the strategic situation. The Soviets possessed inexhaustible reserves. Every German soldier lost was irreplaceable. Mathematics dictated the outcome, but the equation would be written in corpses and ruins. March the 1st brought new crisis from an unexpected direction: Pomerania. The northern flank of the Soviet advance remained vulnerable to German forces in that Baltic province, and Wehrmacht commanders convinced Hitler to authorize a major counteroffensive. It was madness from the start, an attempt to recreate past glories with forces that existed more in imagination than reality. General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel received command of this operation with orders to drive east and sever Soviet supply lines. His available forces amounted to perhaps 80,000 men and fewer than 300 tanks, ambitious but wholly inadequate for the assigned objectives. The offensive began on March the 4th and immediately ran into Soviet defensive preparations. Marshal Zhukov had anticipated this possibility and positioned entire armies to cover his northern flank. What resulted was not the sweeping maneuver warfare of German dreams, but a brutal slugging match in difficult terrain. According to post-war analysis by Western military historians published in authoritative journals during the 1970s, the Pomeranian offensive represented the German army's last gasp in the east. A final expenditure of precious reserves that achieved nothing strategic while weakening the already inadequate defenses of Berlin. Klaus Zimmermann's unit remained on the Oder front, spared from participation in the northern offensive but facing its consequences. Soviet forces, irritated by the German attacks in Pomerania, increased pressure along the entire front. Artillery bombardments intensified. Probing attacks tested defensive positions nightly. The strain of constant combat without relief ground men down to their psychological cores. Klaus watched men who had held firm through weeks of fighting suddenly break, weeping uncontrollably or staring into space with empty eyes. The German army was dying from exhaustion as much as from Soviet firepower. Alexander Sokolov experienced the war's changing nature from his tank commander's perspective. Early battles had possessed a certain desperate glory, defending the motherland, stopping the fascist invaders. Now they were the invaders, pushing into Germany proper, and what they found was both satisfying and disturbing. Villages stood empty, German civilians having fled. Those who remained, mostly elderly, or those with nowhere to go, viewed the Red Army with terror that seemed almost palpable. Some Soviet units maintained discipline, others did not. Revenge for what Germany had done to Russia took forms both official and unofficial, sanctioned and criminal. The Pomeranian offensive sputtered out by March the 20th, having gained perhaps 30 kilometers of devastated countryside at the cost of thousands of casualties and dozens of irreplaceable tanks. Soviet counterattacks immediately reclaimed most territorial gains, and by month's end, German forces were back roughly where they had started, only now they were weaker, more exhausted, less capable of defending Berlin when the inevitable Soviet offensive resumed. Hitler, receiving reports in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, ranted about betrayal and incompetence, seemingly incapable of grasping that Germany had simply been bled white by years of war on multiple fronts. The month ended with German defenders along the Oder, knowing their time was measured in weeks at most. Soviet forces continued building strength opposite Berlin, More tanks, more artillery, more infantry. Reconnaissance flights and intelligence reports painted a picture of overwhelming force being assembled. The only questions remaining were when the final offensive would begin and how long Berlin's defenders could hold. Everyone knew the answers already. Speaking them aloud changed nothing. April the 12th, 1945, brought news that briefly lifted German spirits. President Franklin Roosevelt had died. In Berlin's bunker, Hitler and his court seized on this event with pathetic optimism, comparing it to the death of Empress Elizabeth of Russia during the 7 Years' War that had saved Frederick the Great. Surely this meant the unnatural alliance between capitalist West and communist East would shatter. Surely this meant salvation. It was fantasy, delusion born of desperation. But desperate men clutch at any straw. The reality was that Roosevelt's death changed nothing strategic. The Allied coalition held firm, and Soviet armies continued their inexorable preparations. The final Soviet buildup was staggering in scale. Marshal Zhukov commanded the 1st Belarusian Front directly opposite Berlin, while Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front prepared to strike from the south. Between them they mustered 2.5 million men, 6,000 tanks, 42,000 artillery pieces. The strategy was brutally straightforward. 3 massive penetrations on a front stretching from the Baltic to the Nisa River, enveloping Berlin from north and south while Zhukov's forces drove straight through the city. Every lesson learned in 4 years of war would be applied to Germany's capital. General Gotthard Heinrici replaced the exhausted Harp as commander of Army Group Vistula, responsible for defending Berlin's northern approaches. Heinrici was a defensive specialist, perhaps the Wehrmacht's finest practitioner of that art, and he immediately recognized the impossible nature of his assignment. His forces numbered fewer than 500,000 men, most poorly trained or exhausted, with perhaps 500 tanks scattered across the entire front. The disparity was so vast that military defense was impossible. Only delay remained as an objective. Klaus Zimmermann celebrated his 20th birthday on April the 14th in a bunker overlooking the Oder near Silo Heights. There was no cake, no celebration, only watery soup and stale bread, and the knowledge that the end was coming. The veterans in his unit had fallen silent, conserving energy, checking weapons mechanically. Some wrote final letters to families they would never see again. Others simply sat, smoking the last of their cigarettes, watching the eastern sky. At night, the horizon glowed with the lights of Soviet camps, thousands of campfires stretching as far as could be seen, each fire representing men who would soon try to kill him. Alexander Sokolov's tank had been pulled back for maintenance and resupply, his crew resting in the days before the offensive. The propaganda officers gave speeches about final victory, about avenging 4 years of suffering, about planting the Soviet flag on the Reichstag. The rhetoric washed over soldiers who had heard it all before. What motivated them now was simpler. Finish the job, survive if possible, go home. Germany had to be utterly defeated, its capacity for waging war permanently destroyed, so that never again would Russian mothers weep for sons killed by German bullets. April the 15th saw Heinrici implement a tactical masterstroke, born of desperation. Knowing the Soviet offensive would begin with massive artillery barrage, he ordered his forward positions evacuated just before the bombardment began. When Soviet shells pulverized those positions, they would be empty. His main defensive line lay back from the Oder, positioned to make the Soviets fight uphill for every meter. It was brilliant improvisation, but ultimately just a delay tactic. The mathematics of force ratio meant defeat was certain, only its speed remained variable. April the 16th, 1945, at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, the world ended for a second time. Soviet searchlights blazed to life. Hundreds of them pointed at German positions, turning night into garish, artificial day. Then came the guns. The barrage dwarfed even the January offensive. 9,000 artillery pieces firing simultaneously, delivering such weight of metal that the earth itself seemed to liquefy. Historical accounts in declassified military records describe German soldiers driven mad by the intensity, found after the battle wandering in shock, unable to speak or recognize faces. The bombardment lasted 30 minutes. each minute containing more explosive force than entire battles of earlier wars. Klaus Zimmermann had survived the January barrage and thought himself prepared. He was wrong. The searchlights created disorienting strobe effects as shells exploded in their beams, silhouettes of flying debris casting grotesque shadows. His bunker shook like a ship in a storm, concrete dust filling the air, choking and blinding. Men screamed prayers or curses or simply screamed. When the barrage lifted, Klaus emerged to find the landscape transformed yet again. The careful defensive positions obliterated, communication trenches collapsed, entire sections of the line simply gone. Then came the tanks and infantry. Alexander Sokolov's T-34 was in the second wave, advancing through the smoking wasteland that had been German forward positions. Resistance was sporadic, disorganized. Some German bunkers had survived and fought back fiercely, anti-tank guns appearing from camouflaged positions to knock out Soviet tanks. But these were isolated heroics that could not affect the outcome. The Soviet tide rolled forward, and what it could not destroy, it bypassed. By noon of the first day, Soviet forces had penetrated the forward German lines and were driving toward Silo Heights, the key terrain dominating approaches to Berlin. The battle for Silo Heights lasted 3 days and became one of the war's bloodiest engagements. General Heinrici had positioned his strongest reserves on that high ground, and they fought with the desperation of men who knew this was the last stand. Every house became a fortress, every street a killing ground. Soviet tanks struggled up the slopes into concentrated German fire, suffering heavy losses. Yet the Soviets had losses to spend, and Germans did not. By April the 19th, the heights fell, and the road to Berlin lay open. Klaus survived Silo through luck and the simple chaos of battle. His unit ceased to exist as an organized formation during the second day. He fell back with other survivors, a Kampfgruppe commander collecting stragglers and organizing impromptu defensive lines, then falling back again when Soviet forces inevitably outflanked each position. The retreat toward Berlin was continuous, measured in hours rather than days, German forces dissolving like sugar in hot water. Officers shot soldiers for cowardice or desertion, then were themselves overwhelmed. Military discipline was maintained in some units until the end. In others, it collapsed completely. Marshal Zhukov, watching his forces break through, felt both satisfaction and frustration. Victory was certain, but it was coming slower and costing more than anticipated. Stalin had launched Konev's forces simultaneously in the south, creating a race between the two marshals for the honor of capturing Berlin. This competition was counterproductive. Resources and attention divided between rivals rather than focused on the enemy, but reflected Soviet political reality. Winning the war was important. Getting credit for winning was equally important. The soldiers dying in that competition probably had opinions about such priorities, but their opinions did not matter to men planning parades in Moscow. April the 21st marked the day Soviet artillery shells first fell within Berlin's city limits. The reality of what was coming finally penetrated even the most dedicated Nazis' consciousness. The city had been preparing for siege for weeks, barricades erected, buildings converted to strongpoints, bridges prepared for demolition. The plan was to defend Berlin street by street, building by building, making the Soviets pay such costs that they would negotiate rather than destroy the city completely. It was fantasy born of ignorance about what the Red Army intended. There would be no negotiation, no mercy, only complete and absolute defeat. General Helmuth Weidling received command of Berlin's defense with orders to hold the city indefinitely. Weidling was a realist who understood military impossibility when he saw it. His forces amounted to perhaps 90,000 regular troops, exhausted remnants of units destroyed at Silo Heights, plus 40,000 poorly armed Volkssturm and 20,000 Hitler Youth, many of whom were children aged 12 to 14 given Panzerfausts and told to stop Soviet tanks. The forces defending Berlin's perimeter were scattered, disorganized, lacking unified command structure. Yet they would fight, some from conviction, others from fear, most from simple momentum and lack of alternatives. Alexander Sokolov's tank entered Berlin's outskirts on April the 23rd, and the nature of warfare changed immediately. Urban combat was intimate, brutal, claustrophobic. Tanks became vulnerable in narrow streets, exposed to Panzerfaust teams hiding in buildings. Every window could hide a sniper, every basement a machine gun nest. Progress was measured in meters per hour, each building requiring artillery bombardment or flamethrower teams before infantry could assault. The Red Army had experience in urban warfare. Stalingrad had been the ultimate school. But Berlin was larger, better defended in some respects, its defenders fighting with desperation of the doomed. Klaus Zimmermann's war ended on April the 24th in a cellar in Berlin's eastern suburbs. His Kampfgruppe had been ordered to hold an intersection against Soviet advance. They held for 6 hours, knocking out 3 Soviet tanks and inflicting casualties before being outflanked and overrun. Klaus surrendered when a Soviet submachine gun appeared in the cellar entrance, held by a soldier who looked as exhausted and scared as Klaus felt. The Russian spoke no German. Klaus spoke no Russian. They communicated through gestures. Klaus was herded with other prisoners to the rear. The war for him finished at last. Survival now dependent on the mercy of captors whose country his own had tried to exterminate. The encirclement of Berlin completed on April the 25th, when Soviet forces from Zhukov's and Konev's fronts linked up west of the city. Berlin was now completely surrounded, a cauldron containing approximately 2 million civilians and military defenders. Inside the shrinking perimeter, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food and water supplies were disrupted. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with casualties. Fires burned uncontrolled, spreading block by block. The constant artillery bombardment, Soviets firing from positions surrounding the city, made movement above ground suicidal during daylight hours. Hitler, in his bunker deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, lived in a fantasy world of phantom armies and miracle weapons. He issued orders to units that no longer existed, planned counteroffensives with divisions that lived only on maps. His staff had long since stopped believing but continued the charade, partly from loyalty, partly from fear of his rages, partly from sheer inability to imagine alternatives. The Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was collapsing into its own bunker, surrounded by the ruins of a city it had led to catastrophe, defended by children and old men dying for a cause already lost. The Reichstag building was a fortress. German defenders had converted the massive structure into a strongpoint, barricading doors and windows, positioning machine guns to cover every approach, mining the building's interior. Soviet assault teams had to fight room by room, floor by floor, using grenades and flamethrowers to clear defenders. The battle raged through April the 30th, soldiers fighting in darkness and smoke, often unable to see targets beyond a few meters, shooting at sounds and shadows. Outside, artillery continued pounding the city center into rubble, shells falling so densely that survival was random chance rather than skill. Adolf Hitler, in his bunker beneath the Chancellery, married his longtime companion Eva Braun on April the 29th in a bizarre ceremony that would have been farcical if not so tragic. He dictated his political testament, a document of blame and delusion that held everyone responsible for Germany's defeat except himself. On April the 30th, as Soviet soldiers fought their way through the Reichstag floors above, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Their bodies were carried to the Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline and burned in a shell crater while Soviet artillery fire continued falling. The man who had plunged Europe into the most destructive war in human history died as he had lived, a coward blaming others for consequences of his own actions. Alexander Sokolov's tank unit participated in the assault on the Reichstag's surrounding area, providing fire support for infantry attacks. His tank had survived the entire war, a statistical improbability given tank mortality rates, but was now nearly out of ammunition and fuel. The crew fought exhausted, operating on adrenaline and momentum, knowing the end was near, but still vulnerable to random death in these final hours. They watched Soviet infantry storm the Reichstag, saw the red banner being raised on the building's dome, a moment of triumph and relief and simple exhaustion. The battle continued into May the 1st and 2nd as pockets of German resistance fought on, some unaware of Hitler's death, others simply unable to process that surrender was possible. General Weidling, recognizing the pointlessness of further bloodshed, negotiated surrender terms with Soviet commanders. On May 2, 1945, the Battle of Berlin officially ended. The silence after months of continuous combat was almost painful, unnatural. Survivors emerged from cellars and ruins, German soldiers and civilians alike, into a landscape that resembled hell's antechamber. Buildings reduced to skeletal shells, streets blocked with rubble, bodies everywhere, the smell of death and smoke hanging like fog. Klaus Zimmermann, prisoner since April the 24th, heard about Germany's surrender from Soviet guards. The news brought relief and grief in equal measure. Relief that the killing had stopped, grief for everything lost. His fate now was uncertain, dependent on the decisions of victors who had every reason to be harsh. He would spend the next 5 years in Soviet labor camps before finally returning to a Germany divided, destroyed, occupied. Whether survival justified what he endured was a question he would contemplate for the rest of his life. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Throughout Allied nations, millions celebrated the end of history's most destructive war. In Berlin, there was no celebration, only survivors picking through ruins trying to find food, shelter, family members. The city was a corpse, approximately 80% of its buildings damaged or destroyed, its population reduced from 4.5 million before the war to perhaps 2.5 million traumatized survivors. The iconic Brandenburg Gate stood amid devastation, a monument to vanished empire. The Reichstag, burned and battered, would take decades to rebuild, becoming eventually a symbol of democracy in Germany's second attempt at that experiment. The statistics of Germany's final defense were staggering and horrifying. During the Vistula Oder operation and Battle of Berlin combined, German forces suffered approximately 450,000 killed, nearly 500,000 wounded, and almost 500,000 captured. Soviet casualties were also immense, approximately 300,000 killed and nearly 900,000 wounded, testament to the ferocity of desperate German resistance. According to comprehensive historical studies published in the decades following the war, and drawing on both Soviet and German archives, these final 4 months of fighting on the Eastern Front cost more lives than many entire campaigns earlier in the conflict. Alexander Sokolov survived the war and remained in Germany as part of the Soviet occupation forces. He witnessed the immediate aftermath, the stream of refugees, the starvation, the desperate women trading their bodies for food for their children, the hollow-eyed men wandering the ruins looking for something to salvage. Victory tasted of ashes and regrets. He had avenged Stalingrad, had driven the fascists from Soviet soil and pursued them to their capital's destruction. But what had it cost? He had lost friends beyond counting, had seen things that would haunt his dreams forever, had participated in destruction that made him question whether humans deserved to exist. Klaus Zimmermann's experience in Soviet captivity was harsh but survivable. He worked in labor camps in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, helping rebuild what Germany had destroyed, paying with his labor for crimes committed in Germany's name. Some prisoners died from disease, exhaustion, or guards' brutality, but most survived to eventually return home. Klaus reached West Germany in 1950, finding his family alive but displaced, their Dresden home destroyed in the firebombing. He would spend the rest of his life trying to understand how an ordinary person like himself had become complicit in extraordinary evil, how a civilized nation had descended into barbarism, whether any lessons from such catastrophe could prevent future generations from repeating those mistakes. General Heinrici survived the war in captivity, his defensive skills having saved German lives even in a lost cause. He testified at various post-war tribunals, maintaining that he had fought honorably within the laws of war, that defensive combat to protect German territory was legitimate even in service of an illegitimate regime. Historians debate this distinction endlessly. At what point does defending evil become participation in evil? Can soldiers claim moral neutrality when serving a moral cause? The questions persist because answers remain elusive, uncomfortable, dependent on distinctions between legal and moral culpability that philosophy struggles to define. The Eastern Front's final campaign demonstrated warfare's ultimate futility when pushed to absolute extremes. Germany's military forces, having conquered much of Europe, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union, ended defending their capital's ruins with children and old men armed with obsolete weapons. The Soviet Union, having suffered unimaginable losses and seen vast territories occupied and destroyed, achieved total victory, but at cost that staggered comprehension. Both nations were transformed, traumatized, their futures shaped by scars that generations would inherit. The ruins of Berlin stood as monument to what happens when nations embrace ideologies of racial supremacy and territorial conquest. When diplomatic failure gives way to total war, when restraint and humanity are abandoned in pursuit of absolute victory, the story of Germany's last defenses against the Soviet onslaught is ultimately a tragedy without heroes, only victims and survivors, perpetrators and witnesses to catastrophe. It stands as warning about the consequences of allowing extremism to capture state power, about the costs of wars of annihilation, about how quickly civilization's veneer can shatter, revealing humanity's capacity for organized barbarism. The soldiers who fought on both sides were individuals with families, hopes, fears, yet they participated in machinery of death that consumed millions. Understanding how this occurred, how ordinary people become instruments of extraordinary violence, remains essential if future generations hope to prevent repetition of such horrors. The physical reconstruction of Germany would take decades, but the psychological reconstruction, the confronting of guilt, the acknowledgement of crimes, the building of new national identity not based on militarism and racial ideology, would take longer still. West Germany would eventually emerge as democratic state committed to European integration and human rights, a transformation so complete that it seemed almost miraculous. East Germany, under Soviet occupation, would follow different path, totalitarianism replacing totalitarianism, though of different ideological flavor. The division symbolized Europe's Cold War split, Berlin's ruins becoming ground zero for new conflict between former allies. For the Soviet Union, victory came at price that shaped its future trajectory. 27 million Soviet citizens died during what Russians call the Great Patriotic War, a loss so immense that virtually every family was touched by grief. The trauma-fed paranoia about Western intentions, justified authoritarian controls, created siege mentality that would characterize Soviet behavior throughout the Cold War. The victory over Nazi Germany became central to Soviet and later Russian national identity, celebrated annually with parades and ceremonies that reminded citizens of sacrifices made and enemies defeated. The memory was both source of pride and psychological wound that never fully healed. The civilians caught between the armies suffered fates that military histories often overlook. Millions of German refugees fled westward ahead of Soviet advance, enduring winter cold, starvation, disease. Thousands died on the roads or froze in unheated railway cars. Women and girls faced widespread sexual violence as Soviet soldiers took revenge for German atrocities in Russia. Polish, Czech, and other populations expelled ethnic Germans from territories that had been German for centuries, creating new wave of refugees and suffering. The ethnic cleansing was brutal, but reflected desire to prevent future wars by eliminating minority populations that had served as pretexts for German expansion. The technical lessons learned from the Eastern Front's final campaign influenced post-war military doctrine. The Soviets' operational art, the ability to coordinate massive forces across hundreds of kilometers, to sustain offensives through successive echelons, to combine armor, artillery, and infantry in devastating synergy, became model studied by military establishments worldwide. The German defensive techniques, particularly Heinrich's elastic defense and use of terrain, were analyzed and incorporated into NATO doctrine. The tactical innovations, from Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons to Soviet assault tactics in urban terrain, shaped how armies prepared for potential future conflicts. The moral reckoning with the Eastern Front's brutality continues into the present century. Historians debate the degree to which Wehrmacht soldiers were complicit in Holocaust and war crimes versus simply fighting for their country. The evidence increasingly demonstrates that the regular German military was deeply involved in atrocities, that the clean Wehrmacht myth was post-war fabrication, that millions of soldiers witnessed or participated in crimes. This understanding has slowly penetrated public consciousness, forcing more honest confrontation with the past. Similar debates occur in Russia regarding Red Army conduct, the crimes committed during advance into Germany, the fine line between legitimate revenge and criminal excess. For individuals like Klaus and Alexander, the war's end was not closure but beginning of new chapter. Both men had to rebuild lives in societies fundamentally transformed. Klaus returned to destroyed country occupied by former enemies, its population struggling with guilt and loss, its economy in ruins, its political future uncertain. He found work as teacher, married, raised children, never spoke much about the war. The nightmares eventually faded to manageable levels. He lived to see Germany reunified, the European Union created, former enemies becoming partners. Whether his suffering and his generation's sacrifices had meaning beyond serving as cautionary tale was question without satisfactory answer. Alexander returned to Soviet Union after his occupation service ended, found work in factory, married woman who had survived Leningrad blockade. They had children who grew up in Khrushchev era, experienced the thaw and retrenchment, the stagnation under Brezhnev, eventually the collapse of the Soviet state. He received veterans' benefits and medals, marched in Victory Day parades, attended veterans' gatherings where old men who had been young soldiers drank vodka and told sanitized versions of stories too terrible to share honestly. He died in the 1990s, having seen his country win the greatest war in history, only to lose the peace that followed, dissolving into successor states that argued over the Soviet legacy. The children and grandchildren of those who fought inherited world shaped by that conflict. Europe's integration, NATO's formation, the United Nations creation, nuclear weapons development, decolonization's acceleration, Cold War's dynamics, all flowed from World War II's outcome and the power relationships established by its conclusion. The Eastern Front's final campaign, the Red Army's drive from the Vistula to Berlin, determined which ideology would control Eastern Europe for the next 4.5 decades, which populations would live under which system, where the Iron Curtain would fall. The physical scars eventually healed. Berlin was rebuilt, the Reichstag restored and crowned with modern glass domes symbolizing democracy's transparency. The Oder River Valley, devastated by months of combat, became farmland and forest again. The battlefields where hundreds of thousands died were marked with monuments and cemeteries, places where the living could remember the dead and contemplate war's costs. But the psychological scars, the trauma transmitted across generations, the questions about guilt and responsibility and how to prevent such catastrophes, these persisted, unresolved, perhaps unresolvable. In the final analysis, Germany's last offenses against the Soviet onslaught represented the death throes of regime that had brought catastrophe upon itself and the world. The soldiers who fought, on both sides, were human beings thrust into inhuman circumstances, making choices ranging from heroic to horrific, most simply trying to survive. Their story deserves telling not to glorify war or to assign blame simplistically, but to understand how such events occur, to recognize warning signs when militarism and extremism rise, to appreciate peace's fragility and the ease with which civilization's restraints can shatter. The ruins of Berlin, the frozen bodies along the Oder, the refugees fleeing westward, the tanks burning in city streets. These images should haunt collective memory as reminders of where hatred, nationalism, and totalitarian ideology ultimately lead. The hope, perhaps naive but necessary, is that remembering such horrors might help prevent their repetition, that studying history's darkest chapters might illuminate paths away from similar darkness in the future.